Hello, everyone. Today I want to start talking a bit about schizophrenia. When I had originally started making this series, I had thought to leave schizophrenia off because my intent was to discuss the most common mental health diagnoses that we see here at Sojourn. However, I do know that schizophrenia is one of the least understood diagnoses, and I guess you could call it a personal peeve of mine, to be honest, to see it so badly represented in the media in different cultural sources, because the individuals with schizophrenia are often presented as being violent, as being dangerous, as, feeling out of control, and all of these things that paint a really negative picture of these people. And I've worked extensively with people in the past with this diagnosis, and I can guarantee you that they're nothing like they're portrayed in the media. So I thought that I'd start this series just by going through some very simple, frequently asked questions about schizophrenia before I get more into what is the diagnosis and what does it look like. So the first thing that I often run into with schizophrenia is, is it multiple personality disorder? So often what we see is, especially in the media years ago, or pretty often now too, is the idea that schizophrenia means that you cycle from personality to personality to personality. So often you see someone who is really violent and then switches to a personality that's calmer. First of all, the diagnosis of multiple personality disorders does not exist anymore. It hasn't for quite some time. It's now something in psychology we call dissociative identity disorder. So it's not multiple personality disorder at all. And secondly, schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder look nothing alike. There's nothing related to switching personalities within schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is more of a distortion of the perception of the world as opposed to, a distortion of the understanding of self or the connection with self. The next question that I often run into is, how common is schizophrenia? How often does it happen? And I can tell you schizophrenia is not one of the more common diagnoses. So we guess it occurs in about 1% of the population, generally with an onset in the early 20s. There can be an early onset, as I believe the earliest is age 7. And there can be a slightly later onset, but generally in the early 20s, that's when we really see it start to show itself. And when that starts happening, it can be extremely disorientating for people. So it's something that is good to just be aware of if you're observing an individual in their early 20s who suddenly has a drastic change in behavior. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. The other question I often get asked is, why does this happen? How does this happen? The reality is that we don't exactly know for sure. A lot of disorders involving the brain, we as psychologists, as neuroscientists, as doctors, we understand very little about the brain. And so we know that it has something to do with the levels of dopamine, and we know that it has a genetic component to it. So if you have a schizophrenia diagnosis in your family or in your extended family, then the possibility of it happening will increase. But to be able to say specifically it's this neural pathway or this part of the brain, because of the complexity of the systems, we're unable to say at this point. What we do know from brain scans is that it's not a matter of religious causes. A lot of people that I see, if you have a religious understanding of the world, people often will ascribe it to, say, maybe demonic possession or something more supernatural, something spiritual. And the reality is we can see differences in brain activity between people with schizophrenia and people without, and we can see different deficits in brain formation in people with schizophrenia than in people without. So there's very clear evidence that this is a physiological disorder. This is not a disorder of anything that could be attributed to, more mystical forces, for example. Now, generally, one of the concerns I hear is, well, aren't people with schizophrenia all violent? And the reality is people with schizophrenia, they vary as much as any individual with any other mental health diagnoses. So, people with depression may be experiencing similar symptoms, but I can no more say client A is exactly like client B in every aspect than I can say that someone with schizophrenia is exactly like everyone else with schizophrenia. So first of all, there's many ways this disorder can look, and there's many levels of functionings, and there's many deficits that can come with it. And a combination of all of those things works into the presentation an individual may have. Now, I know that in the news, periodically we hear about individuals who are experiencing what they would call a psychotic break, which means their understanding of reality is really distorted, causing them to take an action or take a violent action. And I think one of the things that I always keep in mind is that when you see stories like that on the news, they make the news because, first of all, they're sensational, and secondly, because they're rare. If it was a day-to-day occurrence, and if it was something that we saw all the time, then it wouldn't necessarily be newsworthy. It would more be like, here's our rates of violent offenders versus non-violent offenders, that sort of thing. But our news stations will talk about what is attention grabbing and what is different. And so it's really important when you see those stories presented that you keep that in mind, that there are very few individuals with schizophrenia that are actually violent, and most of them stay on their medications and are able to have as much of a healthy life as possible. Now, you don't want to confuse schizophrenia with, say, something like a drug-induced psychosis, which can have a very different result just based on the various drugs that have been introduced into the system. So, it's a bit of a differentiation, but it's really important to recognize that, the people that you see walking down White Ave that are kind of talking away to themselves or talking to something invisible or whatever, that they're not dangerous, they're not going to jump out and attack you. The third, the final thing I wanted to touch on is that schizophrenia tends to be treated with medications. And so when people remain on their medications, it can suppress a lot of the distortions of reality that people experience. So it can suppress the hallucinations. It can make the delusions more manageable. But the medications that we have very challenging side effects to them and can cause some metabolic syndrome to start happening, and can, they can improve quality of life in certain areas and make it more challenging in others. So when you are considering somebody with a schizophrenia diagnosis, it's also important to just be aware that, they are struggling in general, either depending on the severity on the antipsychotics or potentially even, not taking them because of how negative they are and how negative an effect they have. So what I really want to encourage people to do is view these individuals as being unwell. Don't view them as, offenders in waiting or as these scary individuals that, it's just a matter of time before they jump out and kill someone. These are human beings who are struggling with a disorder, and they're doing the best that they possibly can. And it's important for those of us in the general public who don't have this disorder to obviously exercise caution, but to not kind of expel them from society just because they are taking an action we don't understand. Because these individuals, they get lonely. They want friends. They want people to talk to. They don't like being the way that they are. So that is what I really wanted to start this series out with. Next video that we put up, I want to talk a bit about the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, the negative symptoms of schizophrenia, and then a little bit about outcomes, as well as a little more specifically about some of the medications that maybe people use to help manage their symptoms. So I hope that was a helpful beginning, and I look forward to speaking to you next time. Thanks.